Christmas time. People give gifts and Christmas cards out of love and tradition. We don't really think about a gift or a Christmas card being an issue. There's a story about a boy who gave a Christmas card to a girl and it cost him dearly. This incident happened to Willie James Howard, a 15-year-old boy with his whole life and future ahead of him. They actually said out of all the students, he was the most likely to really make something of himself. He was in the 10th grade, good-looking kid, hardworking, smart, funny, and a great singer. His only crime back then, he had a crush on a white girl, Cynthia Goff. At this time, schools were still segregated, so that isn't where he knew her from. The two of them were co-workers at the local white-owned dime store, basically a store selling inexpensive items. Christmas time rolls around in 1943. People are decorating and doing the typical traditional things. Willie, being Willie, gives his co-workers Christmas cards, including Cynthia, but hers was a little more special. Hers was signed with L, aka Love. Pretty harmless, right? But in 1943, that can go left real quick. He noticed she was a little put off and uncomfortable with this letter, so he writes her another letter saying, "I know you don't think much of our kind, but we don't hate you all. We want to be your friends, but you won't let us. I wish this was a northern state. I guess you call me fresh. Write and tell me what you think of me, good or bad. I love your name. I love your voice. For a SH, sweetheart, you are my choice." Innocent enough, right? But that would be the beginning of his demise. Now, because it was still a segregated town, they couldn't even drink out the same water fountains as the whites. So a white girl with a black boy, that's criminal to them. Some girls would have just thrown it away, told him, "I'm not interested." Heck, even called him the N-word with the hard ER. But no. Cynthia did something far beyond just mean words. I guess she was so put off by this note, she shows it to her dad. Either she wanted something to happen to Willie, or she was completely oblivious to what happens when a white man is angry at a black kid or person back then. Like, she had to know it wasn't going to end well for Willie. I'm sure their dinner table talks were about how pleasant those Negroes were. Now, her dad, A. Philip Goff, wasn't just some warehouse worker bitter about his job wanting to take it out on someone else. He was a former state legislator, a man who had the power to write and pass laws. It makes you wonder, what laws did he put in place or not put in place to cripple the lives and advancements of black people? So upon receiving this note on January 2nd from his daughter, that, by the way, Willie just gave to her the day before, her dad calls two men to go take a ride to handle some business. S.B. McLears and Reg H. Scott. They got together in the same vehicle, drove to Willie James' house with a plan in place. At a later date, the mom makes an affidavit of what actually happened. She was 34 years old at the time on a Sunday. The dad was at work at the Von Howell Lumber Company. It was in that late morning, a car pulled up, 3 white men got out, 2 stood at the gate of the house, and Philip Goff came to her door. No hi or hello, just, "Where is James?" The dad. "Well, he's at work." "Where does he work?" She told him the Von Howell Lumber Company. Now, before people say, I wouldn't be answering his questions, this is in 1944, a segregated, racist town who was not above lynching women. And there are 3 of them, and just her. So he then asked, "Where's Willie James?" She answered, "Well, he's out back." Just as she does, Willie came into the house and Philip Goff did not hesitate to grab him. Motherly instinct, she tries to pull her son away and kept asking them, "What did Willie do? What did Willie do?" Because she knows he's a good boy, so he couldn't have done anything criminal. But in those white men's minds, he did. So they are struggling over Willie. Philip Goff had enough and pulled his revolver and pointed it at Lola, Willie's mom. She was helpless in keeping her son from being dragged off. As they forced Willie into the car, and the 4 of them drove away. She was chasing after the car, but she didn't get very far. In 1944, 3 angry white men grabbed your black son in the South. One has a gun. She knew his life was in danger. So she's panicked. Her heart had to beat in her stomach. So she went to her husband's job to tell him what happened. Upon arrival, she learns why they wanted to know where Willie's dad worked. They drove to his job and picked him up. Seems brazen and strange to go pick up the dad. That's two people you now have to control. But they already had that thought through. So these men drive to the Suwannee River. They bound the wrists and legs of Willie and stood him at the bank of the river while his father watched. They ordered Willie to jump in or be shot to death. During the car ride, I'm sure Willie is well aware why this is all happening. His crush showed her daddy the letter. Imagine regretting giving a girl a sweet note to where you're now staring at your peril. It's January. It's cold outside. The water's freezing. But the chances of surviving a bullet to the head is slim. Chances of jumping in a cold river bound may have seemed a little more convenient with the hopes of getting free. So, in front of these three racist white men, tormenting a 15-year-old kid in front of his father, Willie jumped in. But without the freedom of your hands and your legs in a body of water, it can take less than 60 seconds to drown. Poor Willie did not stand a chance. Not only is that haunting, what's also chilling, after they forced his dad to watch his only child drown, they drive him back to work like it was nothing. The mom had waited at his job until he returned, and he told her Willie wasn't coming home. But he didn't exactly tell her why or what happened. I'm sure he was traumatized and still trying to process witnessing his child's death. This whole ordeal, from the time she got to her husband's job, realizing he was gone too, and when he got back, was about an hour. But I'm sure it felt a lot longer to Willie and his mom and dad. The sheriff was alerted that Willie's body was in the Suwannee River and told the Blacktown's undertaker to go get Willie's body. And he was immediately buried in an unmarked grave in the colored-only part of the cemetery. A retired teacher from Willie's school at the age of 78, at the time of being interviewed years later, recounts hearing about his death the very next day. The entire school was shook. But it was the 1940s in the South, and they thought the KKK was coming after all of them. But this situation was more direct and personal because of Cynthia. Days later, Lola finally learns from her husband what really happened to Willie, and they're both trying to decide what to do from here. Philip Goff was getting questioned, but denied that he and his friends had anything to do with Willie's, even though all signs point to them. White girl gets love card from black boy. White girl shows white dad. 3 white men kidnap black boy ends up dead. Case closed. But Philip Goff was like, we just wanted to teach him a lesson. The reason we picked him up and his father and drove them to the bank of the river in the middle of winter was so Willie's dad could punish him for trying to get at Cynthia. And we only tied him up so he wouldn't run away. But he got so hysterical, despite having his hands and feet tied, he jumps in the river. And there's nothing we could do. They claimed he committed suicide because he was afraid of being beaten by his dad. That's their claim. This was the affidavit of Philip Goff, and either due to pressure, threats, or intimidation, Willie's dad signed this affidavit, pretty much corroborating Philip Goff's story. Now, despite signing this, James and Lula were in such fear of their lives, they sold their house and moved out of Live Oak to Orlando, Florida on January 7th, just 6 days after their Willie was taken from them. They really thought that they were next. Now, around the same time, an attorney was visiting Live Oak for the Christmas holiday, and he heard about this lynching of Willie because it was just the talk of the town. And he was wondering why it was just talk, but no investigation was going on. And why are these men still walking free? So he alerted the NAACP, and from there, Thurgood Marshall, an employee at the time who would later become the first African American appointed to the Supreme Court, he demanded that the Florida governor, Spencer Holland, open a full investigation. Someone needs to pay for Willie's death. So they impaneled a grand jury to come to a decision about going forward with the trial. Are these 3 white men living in the South in 1944 finally going to face charges for killing the boy. This grand jury doesn't even indict these three men. Not even the main culprit, Philip Goff. Not one charge against any of them. Kidnapping, held against their will, improper use of a firearm, lying to authorities. Nothing. Just walk away scot-free. They don't want to be bothered with the trial because they're going to let them off anyway. So what do? It's 1940s in the South. Unfortunately, this is an incident that will repeat itself when Emmett Till, 14 years old, is years later. No indictments on those white men either. And who knows how many in between, before and after have happened where no one faced justice. Lola Howard stated in her affidavit that a white lawyer came to their new place in Orlando sent by the government. He wanted to know if the affidavit that her husband signed in Live Oak was true. But because they didn't really know who he was, they didn't tell him much. But the husband did state that Philip Goff's account that Willie's committed suicide was not true and the affidavit was false. I don't know what they did with that information, but I do know still no charges were filed. Even though Willie's death is tragic, being another notch in the belt of America's atrocities, it started to fade into the midst of the many lynchings in America's past. Until one day, a funeral director, Douglas Udell, got curious. Remember that black undertaker who was instructed to pull Willie's body out of the river? Well, he kept the records of all the deaths, including Willie's. Udell started researching all of these records and found Willie James Howard, which stated lynched with the initials of the three men responsible. When Udell was a teenager, his great-grandfather was lynched in the 1920s. So Willie's case caught his attention, and he felt he needed to do something to really pay the proper respects to Willie. Because up until then, Willie still lay in an unmarked grave in the once only colored section of the cemetery. On top of that, there was never a birth certificate or death certificate of Willie James. It's like he never existed. So Udell wanted to change all that. He was the Suwannee County Commissioner, and he bought a headstone for Willie that cost $250 that states, Willie James Howard, born July 13, 1928, dies January 2nd, 1944, murdered by 3 racists. A proper headstone, but Udell wanted to do a little bit more, so he held a memorial service at the Springfield Baptist Church where the family had attended in the 1940s. At least 200 people came to pay their respects. Unfortunately, Willie's parents had already passed on, but people who knew Willie growing up got up to speak, and Udell stated that it was very emotional. It's hard to say, especially without being there, why this or other situations didn't gain more outrage, like Emmett Till. People may have been conditioned to, this is just how it is. This is the South. And fear can be very crippling. The KKK is not above so a grown man or woman, that's nothing to them. Yes, we'll never know. But I'm glad Willie received his proper tombstone and memorial service. It only takes one person to want to do the right thing to really make a difference. Just one.